I need to tell you about the Pale before I tell you what we found in Cill Mhóir. Not because the explanation is more important than what happened. It isn't. What happened is the most important thing I have ever experienced in a life that has contained a considerable number of important experiences. But if I tell you what happened without the explanation first, you will not understand what it meant. And it needs to be understood. So, the Pale. In the old tradition, the oldest tradition, the one that predated the Druids and the Standing Stones and the Celtic peoples themselves, the world was understood to have 3 layers, not 2. The other world, above, the world of the Ancient Ones, the Aossi, the beings who had been here before us and would be here after us, separated by the veil. That was the boundary Tom and I had restored. The mortal world, the middle layer, where we lived and breathed and made decisions and dealt with the consequences of them. And below, not below in any geographical sense, below in the sense of what came after, the land of the dead, the place the old texts called Tir na Nog in some traditions, the ever-young land, the place where the dead went and were held gently and did not return from. Not a punishment, not a darkness, simply the next thing for those for whom the mortal world had run its course. That boundary between the living world and the land of the dead was the Pale. And 300 years ago, when the Druids created the second binding, the one Tom and I are the inheritors of, they made a mistake. Not deliberately, not negligently, the kind of mistake that is only visible in retrospect from 300 years of distance by a man with ink-stained hands and an obsessive relationship with texts that were supposed to have been destroyed. They used the energy for the second binding from the Pale. They used the boundary between the living and the dead as a power source for the boundary between the living and the other world. And 300 years of drawing from the Pale had made it thin. Not broken, not failed, thin, the way old fabric goes thin before it tears, still holding, still functioning, still doing the essential work of keeping the dead gently in their place and the living gently in theirs, but thin enough that sound could cross it, thin enough for voices. This was what Sorcha had heard at the 3rd hour after midnight in Cill Mhóir. Not a haunting, not a spirit in any conventional sense, simply the dead, finding the places where the Pale had gone thinnest and speaking through them to the people on the other side whose blood was oldest and most connected to the first binding. Sorcha's blood. 4 generations of the craft in Cill Mhóir before the Aondacht had spent 10 years suppressing it. Old enough. And the voice that had spoken to her, the one she had not written in the letter, but had told the writer to tell us separately, had sounded, she said, like someone Alana might have known. We arrived in Cill Mhóir at midday. Sorcha was waiting at the door of her daughter's house with the expression of someone who had not slept since the 3rd hour after midnight 3 nights ago, and had not expected to. She looked at me. She said, in the flat, direct voice of a woman who had spent 60 years being precise about things that mattered, that she had heard the voice again, last night and the night before. 3 nights in a row now. Always the same voice, always the same words. Tell the marked ones the keeper is waiting. Tell them I have held the door as long as I am able. I looked at Tom. Tom looked at me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I asked Sorcha the question I had been carrying since the writer had told us what she had not written in the letter. I asked her who the voice sounded like. She looked at me for a long time, and then she said a name. The name she said was Mara, my grandmother's name. I want to tell you what happened in my body when she said it, not because the physical detail is the important part, but because I think it is important to be honest about what it is to hear the name of someone you watched burn, spoken in a context that suggests they might still, in some form, exist. My hands went cold, not from the November air, from the inside. My mark, which had been quiet since the binding, that specific, settled quiet of something that has arrived where it was going, pulsed once, warm gold, brief, the way a recognition feels when something you have been looking for without knowing you were looking for it suddenly appears. Tom put his hand on my arm. Not speaking, just there. The specific presence of him at my side that I had come to rely on with a completeness that still surprised me sometimes. Not because it was surprising in any logical sense, but because relying on things was something I had trained myself not to do for 14 years, and the training took time to fully unlearn. I asked Sorcha where the voice came from, which direction, which part of the house, whether it came from the air or from a specific surface or from somewhere she could not locate. She said it came from the old well at the back of her daughter's house. I thought of the river that had forgotten its name, of the oak that had kept what it was given, of water, of boundaries, of the things that remembered their obligations when asked correctly. I told Sorcha that I needed to speak to the well. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has spent 60 years knowing things she could not say and is now, finally, in the presence of someone she can say them to. She said, very simply, without ceremony, that she had been waiting for someone to ask that for 3 nights. She took us to the well. The well was old, older than the house built around it, older than the family that had lived there for 4 generations, possibly older than the village itself. The stones around its rim were the specific dark gray of things that have been outdoors in Ireland for long enough to have become part of the landscape, rather than an addition to it. At the bottom, a long way down, water, still, dark, the specific darkness of deep water in an old well on a cold November afternoon. I knelt at the rim. I pressed my marked wrist against the old stone, the same gesture I had used at the river in the valley, at the standing stone in the forest, at the roots in the garrison cellar, the language that was older than words, the one that existed in the contact between marked skin and sacred stone. I waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from the water, far below, rising through the cold, dark air of the well, a sound. Not a voice yet, a frequency. The same frequency I had felt in the river, in the oak, in the threshold, but different, deeper, as though it came from further away than the bottom of a well in Cill Mhóir, as though the well was merely the thinnest point in a wall that went very far down. And then, the voice. I will not pretend I did not recognize it. I will not pretend that recognizing it was a simple thing. It was not Myre's voice, exactly, not the voice I remembered from childhood, warm and particular, and containing all the specific qualities of one person who had been alive and present in the world. It was changed, in the way that everything changes when it crosses a boundary it was not designed to cross, flattened in some places, deepened in others, carrying the specific quality of sound heard through water or through very old stone. But underneath all of that, underneath every change that 300 years on the other side of the pale had made to the frequency of it, I knew it. I knew it the way I knew my own mark, the way I knew the feeling of the earth under my bare feet on a cold night, the way I knew, without having to look, exactly how far away Tom was and whether he was still. I knew it because it had been the first voice I had ever heard, and the last voice I had heard her use on the night I had stood on a hill above a fire and pressed my fists against my mouth and not called out. It said, in the language that existed before words were shortened, in the form she had taught me at the kitchen table before the world had decided that the teaching was the problem, "Little rock." I held the rim of the well with both hands. Tom's hand came to my shoulder. I breathed. And then, my grandmother, Myre, who had burned when I was 9 years old, who had known exactly what was being done to her and not called out either, who had understood that some things had to be hidden or they would be taken, and hidden the most important one of all in the keeping of a 300-year-old oak. My grandmother told me what she was. She was the keeper, not a title she had chosen, a function she had become, the way the river had become a goddess and the oak had become a repository for everything it was asked to hold in trust. When the first binding was broken 300 years ago, when the creation of the second binding drew from the pail and began the process of thinning it, the pail needed something to maintain it from within. Not a marked bloodline, not a standing stone, not a ceremonial structure of any kind. Something living, something that understood both sides of the boundary because it had been trained to understand them. Something that had spent an entire life learning to maintain things quietly, precisely, and without anyone knowing it was being done. Each generation, the pail chose a keeper, drew them in at the moment of their death, not to punish them or hold them against their will, but because they were the right instrument for the specific task. My grandmother had been the keeper for 14 years. The onduct had burned her on a Tuesday in October. By Thursday, she was holding the pail from the inside, and she had been holding it ever since, alone for 14 years, in the space between the living and the dead, until the pail had gone so thin that she could finally, barely speak through it, until she could finally tell someone that it needed to be fixed, that she was running out of time to hold it on her own. I stayed at the well for a long time, not speaking. After she told me what she was and what she needed, my grandmother went quiet in the way that speaking through the pail required quiet after effort, the way the river had gone quiet after giving me what I needed, the way all things on the other side of very old boundaries went quiet when the speaking had used what it had available. I stayed at the well because leaving felt wrong, because I was 9 years old again and 23 years old simultaneously, standing on a hill above a fire and kneeling at a well in November. And both of those things were the same moment, the moment of understanding that the world was larger and older and more deliberate than any 9-year-old could have been expected to comprehend, and that the deliberateness of it did not make the loss of it any smaller. Tom stayed beside me. He did not speak. He did not offer comfort in any of the conventional ways that comfort is offered, the words, the reassurances, the attempts to frame something incomprehensible into a shape that is easier to carry. He simply stayed, his hand still on my shoulder, his presence at my side as steady and warm as a fire in a cold room, not demanding anything, not requiring anything, simply present in the specific way that meant I could take whatever time I needed without worrying about what it cost him to wait. Warmly, I put my hand over his on my shoulder. He turned his hand and held mine. We stayed there until I was ready to stand up. Then I stood up and told him what she had said, all of it, not carefully, not edited, not filtered through the calculation of what was useful and what was emotionally complicated and should perhaps be set aside until there was more time. all of it, because I had spent 14 years filtering and editing and calculating, and I was done with that. He listened without interrupting. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the direct, precise way he had of cutting to the operational center of something, which I had come to understand was not coldness, but his version of respect, the respect of taking something seriously enough to think clearly about it. He said, "What does restoring the pail require?" I had asked my grandmother that, before she went quiet, before the effort of speaking through the pail exhausted what she had available. She had said this: the pail, like the veil, had been created with a binding. The first binding, older than the Druids, older than the Standing Stones, had used 2 bloodlines. Not our bloodlines, not the bloodlines of the second binding that Tom and I carried. The first binding had used the oldest bloodlines in Ireland, the bloodlines of the people who had been here before the Celts, before the Fir Bolg, before anyone who had a recorded name in any tradition still intact. Those bloodlines were not extinct. They had been suppressed, along with everything else, along with every coven and every sacred site and every piece of knowledge that the Ondacht had spent a generation destroying. But they were not extinct. They were in the northern covens, the oldest ones, the ones someone had been moving through before we arrived, delivering names. Quietly, I looked at Tom. The thing that had been assembling itself in my mind since Devon's letter, the pieces arriving separately, the river, the oak, the garrison, the Fomori, Sorcha, the pail, the voice at the 3rd hour after midnight, my grandmother's name said in a voice that sounded like gardens in difficult weather. It assembled. Someone was moving through the covens with the oldest blood before we arrived, not to harm them, or not only to harm them, to find something, to find the 2 people who carried the right bloodlines for the first binding, the ones who could restore the pail the way Tom and I had restored the veil, before we did. Someone wanted to restore the pail, or wanted to control the restoration of it, and was looking for the instruments to do it with the same systematic, thorough methodology that a former Ondacht scholar with 12 years of access to the original texts would use. Not Devon. Devon was in a monastery with ink-stained hands, reading manuscripts. Someone who learned from Devon, someone who had access to what Devon knew before Devon understood that what he knew was dangerous. Someone inside the Ondacht, someone who had been inside the Ondacht for a very long time. We sent a rider to the monastery that night. The message was short. Tom wrote it, 3 lines in the precise economic script of someone who had spent 10 years writing operational communications and understood that brevity was its own form of urgency. It said, who else had access to the original texts? Who else knew what you knew about the 2 bindings? Who else in the Ondacht had been in a position to read what was supposed to have been destroyed? We did not sleep while we waited. Not because we couldn't. We were tired, both of us. The specific exhaustion of a day that had started with a 2-day-old letter and ended with my grandmother's voice coming through a well in Cill Mhóir. But there was something else. The room at Sorcha's daughter's house was small and had 1 candle and 1 narrow window that looked out onto the back garden where the well was. I lit the candle. Tom did not comment. He sat beside me on the narrow bench beneath the window, the 2 of us together in the candlelight, my shoulder against his arm warm at my side, and we stayed awake together in the way we had learned to stay awake together, which was not with conversation or distraction, but simply with presence, letting the night be what it was, without requiring it to be something else. I thought about my grandmother, not with grief, or not only with grief, with something more complicated that I did not have adequate words for in any language I knew, old or new. She had been holding the pail for 14 years, alone, from the inside, in the space between the living and the dead, which I had never been to, but which I could imagine now in a way I could not have imagined before I had been inside the threshold between the living world and the other world, knowing from that experience what it was to be in a place that had its own rules and its own relationship with time and its own quality of silence. She had been there for 14 years, holding a door for 14 years. I thought about Tom in the forest on Samhain night. 6 hours, cold earth, ion duct torches 20 feet away, not moving. I thought she had done that for 14 years because it needed to be done, because she was the right instrument for the specific task, because no one else was there. I thought she would have understood exactly why he had done it. I thought she would have liked him. Tom turned and looked at me in the candlelight. He said, very quietly, not as a question, reading me the way he read everything that mattered with the complete attention I had come to depend on. He said, "She knew this was coming, didn't she? Your grandmother. She knew what she was being taken toward when they burned her." I thought about it. I thought about the name she had given me, Little Rock, You Will Endure, and the oak she had clearly known to teach me about, the old language she had made sure I could read, the notes in the margins of books that were not standard healing texts, but were specifically, precisely, the knowledge I had needed at every stage of everything I had done in the last 6 days. She knew, I said. I think she knew for a long time. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the voice that was lower and warmer than his working voice, the one that appeared in firelight and candlelight and cold rooms where the work was done for the day, he said that she had done something that could not be repaid, that he understood from his own experience of holding doors that needed to stay open what it cost, that he intended to spend whatever time was available to him making sure her sacrifice, all of it, the burning and the 14 years after, meant what it needed to mean. I looked at him in the candlelight. He was looking back with gray-blue eyes that were doing the thing I still did not have adequate words for, and that I had stopped trying to find words for, because some things were better held than named. I leaned against him. He put his arm around my shoulders. We sat like that until the rider returned at the 2nd hour after midnight. Devon's reply was one name. No explanation, no context, no elaboration. One name in his precise academic script, with the specific quality of a man writing something he had been afraid to write for a long time and has finally understood that not writing it is no longer an option. I read the name. I handed the letter to Tom. He read it. He set it down on the bench between us very carefully. Then he said, in a voice I had not heard from him before, flat and cold in a specific way that meant something had moved past the point of calculation. He said, "I trained her." Her name was Kara, Lieutenant Kara. She had been promoted to the rank 2 years ago, the youngest lieutenant in the Northern Garrison's history, on the recommendation of the captain who had overseen her training personally, Tom. He had trained her for 3 years. He had submitted the report that recommended her promotion. He had told the garrison commander that she was the most analytically gifted officer he had encountered in a decade of service. She was 24 years old. She had been in the Ondoct since she was 16, and she had spent the last 3 years, while Tom was doing Davin's version of the Ondoct's work, doing her own version of it, not the Ondoct's work, her own. Davin's note said she had come to him 4 years ago, before the garrison was built, before the original shard, before any of the plan that Davin had believed was his own plan, and had asked him about the original texts, not as a student, as someone who already knew what she was looking for and needed confirmation that the texts existed. Davin had told her what he knew. He had not understood, at the time, what she was going to do with the information. He understood now. The name of the person moving through the covens before us, delivering names, identifying the oldest blood, finding the two people who carried the right lineages for the first binding, was not someone acting against the old ways. She was acting for them. She was looking for the people who could restore the Pale. She was doing exactly what Tom and I were doing, trying to fix something broken, except she had been doing it for 3 years longer, and she had made, along the way, decisions about how to do it that had cost people their safety and their cover, and in Breed's case, their life. She had made those decisions with the precise, cold calculation of someone who had been trained to assess acceptable losses in pursuit of a mission objective. She had been trained by the best person the Ondoct had. I looked at Tom in the candlelight. He was looking at the letter. His expression was doing something I had only seen it do once before, in the forest on Samhain night, when he had looked at the torches of the garrison soldiers moving between the trees and understood in real time that a version of himself he had been constructing for 10 years had become something he could not return to. He was doing that again now, looking at something he had made and understanding what it had become. I put my hand on his. He turned and looked at me. I said, and I meant it in every possible sense of the words, "This is not yours." She made her own choices. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, with the specific quality of a man accepting something without requiring it to be comfortable, he said, "I know, but I am going to find her anyway." I looked at the letter on the bench, at the single name in Davin's precise script, at the candle burning between us, and the well in the garden beyond the window, where my grandmother's voice had come through the Pale to tell us that she was running out of time to hold it alone. 3 bindings now, the veil restored, the Pale failing, a keeper inside it who had been holding the door for 14 years on borrowed time, and someone moving through the covens of the oldest blood with 3 years head start, and a methodology that had already cost at least 1 life and would cost more. I stood up. I looked at the candle. I thought of my grandmother in the space between the living and the dead, holding the Pale from the inside, patient and precise, and utterly alone. And I thought, not much longer. We are coming. I blew out the candle. End of Season 2, Episode 3. Next, Kara. What she wants, what she has already done to get it. And the moment Tom Ardagh comes face to face with the most dangerous thing he ever made, a version of himself without the part of himself that Alana changed.